Okay. Fantastic. So welcome everyone. I hope you had I don't know, strange times. I hope you had a good reading, a good weekend. I feel a little bit guilty about. Yeah, it's like enjoying my time. I had a nice weekend, but it's like there's war in Europe, so it's a little bit strange to say that one has a good weekend when there's so much crazy stuff going on in the world. But let's not get distracted. Let's focus on the things we can influence, and let's talk about attitudes this week. Before I want to do, or I started recording. That's very good. I just want to highlight this. Today we have a double header, okay? And you don't have to attend both of these sessions, obviously. So instead of the course or like the office hour, we have the coursework session in the afternoon at 1 p.m. So I would have this session and stop the Zoom session, give myself 5 minutes, and then we basically the same link, we will have the coursework session. I will repeat this at the end of this lecture again, just to make sure that everyone is on board. But so if you, we at the end of the week, we will release the scenarios for the coursework. And so in the group seminars and the group work in the seminars, we already started kind of like getting you familiar with the marking criteria and getting to a little bit more into the whole coursework. But this week and then after reading week, we will focus on this as well. Speaking of the seminars, I think I was kind of blown away from last week. The coursework that you submitted, not the one like basically from week 3 on Darth Vader. Most of you probably know what I'm talking about. I think we never had that many submissions for one topic. Every group had at least one submissions. Most groups had several submissions, and I think like that was great to see. It was great to see all the to read, to kind of see your funny ideas that you had. And I will actually come back to this in a coursework session, highlight how important this exercise was that we did and that you guys did. I didn't do it in the in week 3. And so this is really good. I think I'm super happy with how many people actively participate in these seminars. It's a huge improvement from last year. One thing I want to talk about now, and I just want to take 5 minutes out of this lecture to get a little bit feedback from you guys. We are heading towards reading week. This is our chance for Yasmin, for Connie, and for me to kind of step back and say, like, is this module overall working? What are our impressions? What can we do better? What is not working? And I think for us, it would be really good to know the things that work and the things that do not work. And hence, I would like to take 5 minutes out of this lecture and just put a Qualtrics link into the chat, which I will do now. And I hope this it's the right one. And I would really strongly encourage you to please just click on this link. It will take you like 5 minutes. I would stop the lecture for 5 minutes, and I will stop the recording also. And then we can, you guys can let me know what is working, what is not as working, what do you want me to change, etc. And then I have the chance to kind of digest that, and then after reading week, make these adjustments. So please click on the link and use your chance to make yourself heard. That would be really helpful for the 3 of us who actively run this module. And yes, and I think if you're done, it would be great if you could put something like done in the chat. I estimate it takes like 4 or 5 minutes to do the whole thing, and I would just pause this now for 4 or 5 minutes and then come back to the fantastic. And thanks everyone for taking the time to fill out this questionnaire. If you're watching the recording, then you find the Qualtrics link also on Moodle. You can do it there. Would really appreciate to hear your opinion as well, even if you didn't join the live lecture, especially if you're one student, for instance, who's never coming to the seminars. We would love to hear from you as well, if there's anything we can do in order to lure you into the seminars. And thanks everyone who put in a chat that they've done it. Really appreciate it. That made that so much quicker and more effective. Okay, let's talk a little bit social psychology. Okay, I restarted the recording just to make this make sure that I record it, and let's talk about attitudes. Attitudes is like a strange, like if you think about social psychology, you might not think about attitudes as the first thing, but somehow this was for a very long time and still is one of the main focuses of social psychology. In the beginning of social psychology, here you see Gordon Allport, one of the kind of founding fathers of social psychology. He said that basically the study of attitudes is social psychology. This is the main focus. This is what we should worry about. This is what we should care about. And so a lot of social psychology in the preceding 90 years focused on attitudes. So why are we so interested in attitudes? So one reason was that kind of the phenomenon that we assumed that the phenomenon we are interested in are somehow related to attitudes. So this is a study that was done by Lapierre very early, or not very early, like in the 30s of the last century. And what he was interested in was the attitudes people had around the US towards Chinese immigrants. And in particular, he was interested what happens if he would go around the US and ask people, like he would come with a Chinese couple into a restaurant and see if they would be served or not. Right. And so what kind of attitudes did the servers, the people who owned these restaurants have? He did it two ways. He actually went with the Chinese couples, traveled around the US and visited these restaurants and see how people are actually acting or how they're behaving towards this Chinese couple in order to get a feeling for the attitudes towards Chinese immigrants at that time. He also phoned all of these restaurants and asked them a month earlier if I would come with two like with a couple of Chinese immigrants, would you serve me at that restaurant? Sadly, I think about 90 to 95% of the restaurant's owner at that time said that they would not, on a telephone, that they would not serve the Chinese couple. But here, and we come back to this in a minute, but here you can see why social psychology early on, this is actually a sociologist who did this study, but in the 30s, sociology and psychology were more kind of more interlinked. But here you can see why we were so interested, and we thought like, oh, there's an interesting phenomena, something like racism, prejudice, stereotypes, and somehow attitudes play into that. Where are they coming from, and how do people act on them, right? So one of the things, and I come back to that in a second, it's the promise of attitudes is like that they predict how we behave, right? If I have a positive attitudes towards Chinese immigrants, then I will serve them. And so he wanted to know, how do these attitudes measured via the telephone actually link to the behavior when the couple comes into the restaurant. Another really popular attitude that social psychology in particular, but psychology was enamored at in, like especially in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, is like self-esteem. There's a self-esteem movement, and we will have a whole chapter on this in the additional videos, and we will talk about this in the live lecture as well. And this is this idea that like self-esteem, the attitude you have towards your own self, the how you evaluate your own self, has this profound impact on our lives. Here's like one of the quotes by, I think it's Jason Brandon, I'm not quite sure, and he was from this so-called self-esteem movement, and he's like, self-esteem has a profound consequences for every aspect of our existence. Cannot think of a single psychological problem, from anxiety to depression, to fear of intimacy or of success, to spouse battery or child molestation, that is not traceable to the problem of low self-esteem. I often have this quote in my lectures. I repeat the same in a third-year elective, and students often, they only watch the start of my lectures and never made it to the end of the recording. Take this away as to be the truth. This is a complete, I don't know, complete failure. It is a failure. This idea that self-esteem, and if we can change people's self-esteem, will somehow magically transform their lives, is a complete failure. The self-esteem movement is something we don't do anymore, and we don't think about trying to help people with lower self-esteem to have higher self-esteem. This is something that still kind of clings on in popular psychology, but it's not an academic idea. It was somehow related to a failure. And if you're more interested in that, then you can see, watch the additional videos where I explain that. I will also explain in chapter 2 today a little bit why the measurement of self-esteem is so problematic and why this might cause so many problems. But this was one idea, just a specific attitude that people have about themselves, and you know how the self, how important that is for social psychology in order to understand people's behavior. Another one is really like this, which I think if you're kind of following any type of media, there's like, oh, global spread of political polarization. There's this idea out there that basically parties, members of parties are so strongly polarized. So for instance, in the US, it would be Democrats and Republicans. In the UK, it would be Labour and the Tories, right? And they're so strongly opposed to each other. They have such negative attitudes towards each other that they can't even be friends, right? Here's an article from The Guardian where it's like, can you actually be a friend with somebody who does not share your political attitudes, right? So there's this idea that basically what's driving at least Western societies apart is like these the attitudes people have towards their political parties, their own, but also and importantly towards the party of the or the opposing political party. So political polarization is one phenomenon that has fascinated social psychologists for decades, and the idea here is that attitudes are at the heart of that. There's also this, like when we talk about in our last lectures, like in I think 8 and 9, and then we come back to pro-social behavior. But when we talk about is how do others influence us, right? There's this idea of social influence. Here on the right, I have a picture of Bernie Sanders with his mittens, right? Somehow he was like during the inauguration of the current US President Biden, the president, right? He was wearing these mittens, and just by seeing these mittens, somehow everybody wanted to have mittens like that, right? So there's something that you see somebody on TV and somehow that changed their attitude, right? And we come back to the most influential book by Robert Cialdini, a social psychologist who wrote about this. And here the key idea is that basically the way others influence our behavior is through changing our attitudes. And then I think, and this is something that's really at the heart of most of psychology, especially applied psychology, is the idea that our attitudes predict our behavior. This is one of the most popular, by far maybe one of the most, if not the most influential theory in psychology, and that's the theory of planned behavior. If you, for instance, do health psychology in year 3, then you will see that most of health psychology basically builds on this idea. And here it's like, why is it so? So here they would say like, okay, what is the key idea of the theory of planned behavior? It is that attitudes, norms, and behavior control influence our intentions. So for a long while, it was assumed that basically attitudes are the strongest predictor of our intentions, and our intentions are our strongest predictors of our behaviors. So for instance, if I want to explain in health psychology why some people get a vaccination and some not, then I have to look at, okay, who doesn't have an intention to get vaccinated or not, and how can we help those who do not have that intention to get vaccinated to have a better attitude towards vaccinations, okay? We will talk a lot about norms when we talk about social influence as well, but these are often these two key components. Behavior control is the belief that I have control over the behavior I want to perform, so that I can actually, if I want to get vaccinated, that I actually can find the time and the resources to do so. But this is basically, there's this key idea which we come back in our last chapter of the additional videos in this week's content, is that attitudes drive behavior. The attitude that I have towards something, towards you, towards a product, towards a political party, that drives my intention, how I want to behave, and that then predicts my behavior. And hence, we're so interested in attitudes. But there's this weird thing, which will be basically the central tenet of next week's, or like not next week's, but next lecture. I think we have the reading week in between. It's like there's this weird disconnect often between attitudes and our behavior. And we are trying to explain that as well, where people are like, oh, maybe we have to find unconscious ways of biases in order to predict their behavior. So if you remember the study that I started with, where Lapierre did two things. He called people up and said, like, if I come with a Chinese couple to your restaurant, then would you be willing to serve us? And 95% of the owners of these restaurants said, no, I will not. But then Lapierre actually went with a Chinese couple into each of these restaurants that he called, and now it flips. About, I think, only one restaurant rejects to serve them. All the other restaurants are fine in serving them. This is kind of like a little bit like the opposite of what we normally find, where people kind of claim to be not racist, but then act racist. But it tells us in a kind of memorable anecdote that, hey, what often is disconnected, and which then brings us to next week's topic, and we end this week on that, is that while we hope that attitudes really influence our attentions, often, or at times, often is too strong, at times they don't. And we are trying to better understand that. So the idea here would be, if you want to understand racism, if you want to understand sexism, other really kind of hot topics, political attitudes, then we might have to find different ways of measuring these attitudes. Okay. This is basically what we are trying to do in the live lecture today. We'll see how far we got, but we will talk about attitudes. We will talk about measuring attitudes. It's more interesting, I promise you, than it sounds. And then we will talk a little bit about where our attitudes have come from, okay? So why am I a member of this and not that political party? And then we will talk in the additional videos about attitude formation, the social environment, how others might impact our attitudes. We will talk about the self-esteem movement, and we will talk about attitudes and behaviors. And in each of these chapters, we touch upon like one of the key findings in psychology in general and social psychology. So there's a lot of really critical content this week. I say this every week, and it's true for every week, but this week in particular. All right, so let's try to figure out if we can check our attitudes and can see what psychologists think an attitude is, what we feel that we measure when we measure attitudes. And I said feel, which is like a weird expression, but it kind of foreshadows a little bit what psychologists define as attitudes. And it's basically an evaluation of an attitude object. An attitude object can be everything. It could be another person, it could be a telephone, an iPhone, it could be yourself, etc. Okay, and it's like how, like if you have to evaluate it overall, how positive or negative do you feel towards this attitude object? Okay. So that is the general description. You can see here is I have something like a really positive, and here I have a really negative attitude. But one thing it's important is that you can have basically for an attitude object here, for instance, for your father, you can have also a mix of emotions, right? And for most of the attitude objects we have, it's not just generally positive or negative. So let's say we would ask a child here how she thinks about her father, right? In the beginning, and this is a characteristic of our emotional development, which you probably had in developmental psychology, we are very bad at tolerating any type of kind of conflicting emotions. So if you ask my son, then like, what do you think about your father? I hope, I'm just pretending now, it's probably not true, but he's like, oh, my father is amazing, right? And he would say often things that are like outrageously untrue. He's like, oh, my father is the strongest, he's the fastest, he's the best, he's the richest, and so forth. I think he can't really like tolerate any negative meanings or any negative parts of his belief system about me. And this is a characteristic of our like of very young children and their attitudes, that they're very positive or very negative. You're either the worst or the best. And then the older we grow, it becomes a little bit more sophisticated. So, right, if I ask you about your father now, you might feel like, okay, you might have an overall positive, oh, this is like a wrong way. Why is this? This is the wrong way around, right? But you might have a it's like an overall positive attitude, but you might also have a little bit of negative feelings or some aspects of your father that you do not like, just as there are some aspects of all the people we have in our life that we really, really like, and some of them that we do not like. So sometimes we might feel really ambivalent about this, something we come back. So I could have a positive and a negative parts of my evaluations. Overall, this might be positive, but the presence of some negative aspects of my attitude are really important, and we have to capture them when we measure them. An indifference would be if I don't have any, right? You kind of feel like, okay, Donald Trump, right? He used to be such like a provoking, polarizing figure. Maybe now we feel like we moved on. It's in the US anyway, and you don't really have any attitude towards that, right? So this is basically when you neither have any positive nor negative feelings towards, then we feel indifferent about it, right? Often, if we meet a new person, if we see a new product, if we hear a new movement, we might feel in the beginning indifferent, and then the psychological spiel and subsequently forms how we feel about the party, the game, the whatever, the phone, the product, etc. Just to kind of remind you a little bit and connect it to some of the previous stuff we have done, right? We know that we have some kind of evaluations, right? Out of like almost automatic or not almost automatic evaluations of other people where we form immediately attitudes towards them. Here, for instance, Alex Todorov's research showing that certain facial features, right? If a face looks like it is smiling, then we immediately feel more positive towards them than if they're not smiling. If they have a more baby-faced shaped facial features, then we feel more positive towards them than if you do not have that these baby-faced features, right? So here we know already a little bit about how people form certain attitudes, right? So the warmth and competence and morality evaluations that I do for automatically for a face then forms or informs my attitude, my overall evaluation of that person. So this is just kind of to remind you that it's not like we're not starting from scratch. That connects to the research we have done or talked about so far as well. So why are people so interested in attitudes? One of them is identity. You remember in the beginning when I talked about identity in the second lecture, we talked very much about how important it is to understand social phenomena. In order to understand social phenomena, we have to understand what is at the heart of their identity, right? And so you can see here, there's like the attitudes are often part of our identity. I am a person that really likes the Labour Party, really dislikes the Tory Party, or vice versa, or who feels really negative towards both of these parties, or you might feel indifferent about it. But that makes your identity. How, right? This is really central to your identity, whether you're a political or non-political person, or whether you care about these products, whether you have a positive attitude towards certain religions or not, etc. Right? This is part of your identity. So a certain set of attitudes is at the heart of your identity. It is also, it really shapes the way we process information, right? So if you, for instance, are strongly in favor, have a very strong positive attitude towards one party, but a negative attitude towards another party, then the way you process that information is very differently. A lot of people were for a long time, really interested in how people who have a negative evaluation of themselves process information, even positive information about themselves. How do they maintain their negative self-view, right? But here's interesting for us to see that the attitude I have towards a certain object really strongly impacts the way I process information related to that attitude attitude object, okay? And so there's this kind of, it's part of my identity, it's kind of shapes the way I perceive the world, the way I process information about things around me. It kind of guides how I select information to process and neglect other information. It also shapes my behavior, right? We come extensively back to that, but the idea is here that, okay, our attitudes directly impact the likelihood that I perform a certain behavior or not. For instance, you can think about if you're interested in marketing, right? If I have a positive attitude towards a certain product, I'm more likely to buy that product, right? And so it becomes a little bit more complex for a little bit more complex complex relationships that we have. But this is the key idea behind that. Often this is talked about the ABC of attitudes. You can kind of summarize that. There's an affective component, a good or bad in evaluation, right? For instance, you might think about your self-esteem, right? Just like a good or bad attitude towards yourself. This is related to certain behaviors, right? If you have an attitude towards an object, I just talked about, this is related. It will motivate you to do things and motivate you to like do not certain things. And there's cognition attached to that, right? So if you think about why do I have a certain type of attitude towards myself or towards others, towards minorities or majorities or wherever you stand, then this comes with a set of beliefs, right? So that then inform our attitudes. And we have more on that when we look a little bit into racist attitudes and sexist attitudes in 2 weeks, right? But all of these components play a role there. And you can just easily memorize that with the ABC of attitudes. All right. Oopsala. I would address the questions in the chat after the lecture's over, if that's okay. Okay, so measuring attitudes, right? I think so. We kind of have this. In fact, I can maybe address just this question here. What do you mean by affective? Affective is our emotional responses, right? Emotions are full-blown kind of phenomena that we very rarely experience. Affect is this positive or negative evaluation that we have of something, right? So I think if you ask about like the affective component of self-esteem, then this would be whether I have a positive and or negative attitude towards myself. Okay, and that's basically what we mean by the affective component of these attitudes. I hope this clarified it. So now let's think a little bit like a long part of, or extensive part of the research on attitudes in social psychology is about measurements. This becomes even more interesting when we talk about next week about how we measure implicit, these so-called unconscious, which is not true, but the so-called unconscious biases that we have, right? How can we measure, for instance, if somebody has a racist attitude or not? But we start off a little bit more, kind of like a little bit more naive, you could say. And research basically just started to ask people about certain types of their attitudes. For instance, there's like self-esteem. We come back to that at the end of this section again, but how much a person values themselves, right? So we had this kind of, we just had the question and we had this aspect, the affective component of your self-attitude, of your self-esteem. So how positive or negatively you think about yourself. Often people nowadays for self-esteem use explicit measures. That's by far the most used. There are also implicit measures, which we talk about next week, in 2 weeks about, to measuring self-esteem. But explicit measures are basically measures where I ask you to self-report, okay? So most of them, people, this is from one of my studies, when you're interested in self-esteem, you just ask them, I have high self-esteem. This is when you just want to see it as a control variable or something like that, right? So people, you can basically, it gives us a really good rough indicator if you have high self-esteem or not, right? So this is a one scale, like one item self-esteem scale. This is based on the Rosenthal's self-esteem scale that you see here that has in total 10 items. I only put 6 on here. So on the whole, I'm satisfied with myself. At times, I think I'm not good at all. I feel that I have a number of good qualities. I feel I do not have much to be proud of. Okay. So if you measure these 10 items and then correlate them with the item on the left, you see there's a very strong and high correlation. It seems they both seem to capture the same thing, the attitude you have towards yourself and how you perceive yourself. Okay. So that's an example of an explicit measure of an attitude. This is like how most people measure self-esteem, because there's a long tradition. And if you want to connect your findings to the findings of people beforehand, then you use their same measures in order to be part of that conversation. How do we measure political polarization? So here, political polarization is often measured by asking people how warmly or coldly they feel towards a party. Remember that we had this kind of idea, right, from 2 weeks ago about basically warmth and competence, right? And here there's like, okay, I just explicitly ask you how warm or cold you feel towards the party. Here you can see basically the political polarization is then defined as the difference in these measures. So the bigger the difference here is, the more you can see political polarization. So a person who is basically kind of has both as around the 50 has very little political polarization, and the more extreme it could be, for instance, a 90 and a 10, the more political polarized it is. What you can see in general is that for countries, for instance, like the US, where political polarization is increasing, is that the feelings towards their own party in the US are basically the same, whereas the feelings towards the other party go down, 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 down. And this is driving the increase in political polarization. Okay, so here you can see I can have like two kind of competing attitudes towards like which party should I vote. I have one attitude object as one party and the other, and then I can make something out of the difference. So sometimes we're interested in the difference between two attitudes and not just into one attitude in particular. And you can easily see why this would matter in this case. Here you see, if you kind of use this question here and map out what has happened since the 1980s to affective or political polarization. This is the difference score that I just showed you on the slide before, and that you can see that basically in the US, it's getting worse and worse and worse. People are more and more and more politically polarized in the US. And as I just mentioned before, and you can see what is driving that is that they feel less favorable towards the other party, and not so much how their feelings are changed over for their own party. You can ask yourself, what do you think is the trend in the UK? It's like, if I would map the same thing for the UK, what kind of graph do you expect? Do you expect an increase in polarization, or a decrease, or maybe a stagnation in polarization? You can pause for yourself for a moment and think about it. But what you can see in the same data, right, the scales are a little bit different here. This is just to kind of be consistent how it was measured in Britain, but it's the same idea. You can see that in the UK here, we actually have a slight decrease in political polarization. Often people, when I talk about it, it's like, oh, social media is making everything worse. Everybody is politically polarized, etc. Never say like that. It's true for the US, but it's not true for the UK. If you think about the 1980s, where the whole country was on strike constantly, people were fighting, like the parties were actually fighting, police was fighting against the miners on strikes and so forth. It was much more polarized than it is today, but we kind of forget. But it also tells us a little bit, and I want to kind of leave it with that here, that it can't be that Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and all the other wonderful platforms are all making us more politically polarized, because you can see, for instance, that this is the case in the US, but not in Britain. You can see in Germany, it's falling actually. And there are other countries, I think like Sweden, where political polarization is falling even more dramatically. And these countries have access to Facebook, to Twitter, to Instagram and TikTok, etc. as well. So it can't be just that it's all about social media that's driving political polarization. In some country you can find it, in some not. One thing that's really interesting is a slightly outdated slide here, but it's something that's called attitudinal ambivalence. And that's often important when we try to understand an attitude towards somebody. Then we kind of look at, okay, is this, so here in these, like in a example on the left, Logan Paul and KSI. I made this slide 2 years ago. I don't know if you're still familiar with that. At that time, two of the most famous YouTubers. I've never actually watched a video by Paul Logan, but I watched some of KSI. I think he's doing still quite well. And here you can see on the left, right? This is basically where you have to kind of decide who do you want, right? Like, do you want to have a KSI? So how warmly do you feel towards him, right? And you can only measure how warmly you feel towards him, but it would be also interesting to additionally measure how coldly you feel towards them. And that seems weird because so far we were thinking about, if we think about warmth, that's just one dimension from cold to warm. But if you think about back to that slide where we had this ambivalence, then it's often really like this kind of like this 2x2 diagram with like positive attitude, negative attitude, and then we had ambivalence and indifference. Often it's really telling and really interesting to know if people not just have a positive, but also a little bit of a negative attitude mixed in there. So why is this interesting? Because often if we measure both of these dimensions, we can better predict behavior. Okay. So here are just two examples for two studies, but this is one where they basically try to use attitudes towards healthy food to predict how likely it is that you eat healthy food, right? And it could be something that's like, oh, how much do you like this item? Like how warmly, how good you feel does, for instance, I don't know, like a tomato or a salad or something taste? And people would report that, and it's not a very strong predictor of how they feel towards or how they will actually act when they have the chance to eat a tomato or a carrot or something healthy along on similar lines. Then purely the positive one doesn't really predict the behavior very well, but it does predict the behavior very well if I introduce also the negative. So you might feel like, oh, I have a really positive attitude towards certain healthy foods, but there are also aspects I don't really like, right? And that will be a much better predictor of whether you do it or not. You can say, or like whether you eat the food or not. You can see the similar thing about when we talk about self-esteem. If you're trying to kind of change basically the attitude somebody has towards themselves, and this is either the negative attitude is like, I only have negative things and there's nothing positive, versus I have a really negative attitude, but there are also some things I like about myself. Then for the latter, addressing that makes it much more likely that you can change the attitude people have towards themselves, versus there's no positive aspect people have in the attitude towards themselves. It's almost impossible to then find an entry point to change them. So emotional ambivalence towards a attitudinal object, affective ambivalence is the better word. If we think about the ABC of attitudes, then if measuring that is a real good predictor of our behavior, it's much better than just measuring one or the other. Okay. There's another really important principle. We come a little bit back to that when we talk about predicting attitude or predicting behavior from attitudes, but it's the correspondence principle. So at some point here in this article by Ajzen and Fishbein, I find like, attitudes don't predict behavior very well. And so what they said, like what the key problem is that we often have too big of an attitude measure that is too unrelated, too unspecific to a certain behavior. So for instance, you might measure self-esteem and then you want to predict whether you attend this lecture or not, right? And it's such a global evaluation that has very little to do with whether you come to this lecture or not. And then so this is not a good measure for predicting your behavior. If I want to know whether you will attend in 2 weeks this same lecture, then I have to kind of say, okay, I have to ask you about this. For me to attend live lectures in social psychology on a regular basis is, right? And this is a kind of like, I'm not sure why I had this twice there, but this is something where you want to have a really specific prediction. Right? You really specific measure. So if you measure attitudes, they have to correspond to the behavior. The stronger, the closer they correspond, the better the predictive value of these measures. So if you want to have something, you shouldn't ask, oh, how much do you enjoy online lectures? And he's like, I don't know. I don't like Andreas online lectures, but if Elliot talks about perception, I really enjoy that. Okay, so I kind of middle it out between the negative evaluation of myself, the positive evaluation about Elliot's perception measures, and now you have something in the middle, but that will not be very predictive from whether you attend my lectures or not. So it's really important that you have a corresponding way of measuring the attitude. Okay. Let's come back to another kind of problem that in particular plagued self-esteem measures. And that's something that's like, what are we actually measuring? As you can see, in some weird way, the questions that we use to measure attitudes are relatively deceptively simple, right? I have high self-esteem. I feel positive towards whoever, right? KSI. But there might be so many things that play into that kind of produce these positive or negative attitudes. And the problem with self-esteem and measuring self-esteem is often that we kind of measure two different, almost like two twins, like a good twin and an evil twin. And we can't really separate what are we measuring. The key idea here is between like, why would we be so interested in self-esteem? And the idea, the beginning idea, the starting idea of the kind of self-esteem movement in the 80s in California that still resonates with pop culture today, right, was basically, I look at people who are happy, who are successful, who do, like, who, isn't there something like, who are not pregnant as teenagers, who are not criminal, who don't do drugs. And what I see, all of these people have high self-esteem. Right? So the idea is like, oh, if I take all the people, which is actually turns out it's not true, but that was the idea. They would just kind of look at it, just like, oh, who are the people who are performing well in Andreas' class? Oh, look, these people have high self-esteem. So that must be kind of the reason. If we change that high self-esteem, then this would kind of change also the performance in Andreas' lecture, the likelihood of them taking drugs, joining a gang, or becoming pregnant too early in their life. But that's the kind of idea that this task force in California had, and why they were interested in increasing self-esteem. But one of the things I think I always enjoy watching these videos here. You can watch them. The links are in the slides. I think we don't have quite time to do this. But this is a guy, I think he's Hard Rock Nick. Yes, that's his name. Good, I put it in there. And he has these videos where, I mean, to me, in my lay, well, I'm a professional, but from my professional examination or analysis of his behavior, he seems to be an extremely insecure person, but in some ways who's really narcissistic, who deals with his insecurities very narcissistically. So he would always say, he start his videos and say like, where am I? Where are you? Or either this way or the other way around. And then he would stand in front of, on the left video, he stands in front of kind of like a stupid luxury car that is probably not his car. And he says, oh, I'm here in front of my car about to meet this celebrity and have a fantastic day. Where are you? Right? And on the other hand, he says, like, oh, I'm here in Bel Air in front of the Bank of America. I'm about to deposit 50,000 cash or something like that. And you can see that he's not, it just doesn't really seem true. But the idea, why do I have Hard Rock Nick here? And is he fake flexing? Because I think he's fake flexing. Everyone who watches these videos feels like he's fake flexing, right? He's kind of pretending to be something that he isn't. But what would happen if I would ask him, do you have high self-esteem? And I think Hard Rock Nick would say, yes. Yes, there's like, I'm satisfied with myself. I have good qualities. I feel that I'm a person of worth, and so forth, right? So if we would measure somebody who's really successful, he would have high self-esteem. But there's this other kind of twin, the evil twin of the high self-esteem, which is like this fragile, narcissistic part of self-esteem. And so what you measure often with attitudes is like one person has a positive or negative attitude towards themselves, but out of very, very different reasons, right? when you kind of look into research on high self-esteem, what does it actually measure? There's like deception, right? We talked about self-enhancement. So if you, like one of the key findings, the weird findings of the, not for us, it's not very surprising, but I think for the Californian task force in the self-esteem movement that tried to increase self-esteem in California, was like most people actually have really high self-esteem. If it would explain all the problems in the world, then it's kind of weird that most people already kind of have solved this problem, right? And we know why this is the case, because there's this motivation to self-enhance, right? We see each other better than we actually are. So what you can kind of measure with high self-esteem is often, if you have a very high self-esteem, you have very active defensive processes, right? So it might be that somebody is actually not doing very well, but so what happens is that the defensive mechanisms are in full throttle, and that produces this high self-esteem. So it actually, high self-esteem becomes like an indicator that something is off rather than that something is good. Okay. Temporal stability. So this is something where it's like these two others, where it's like, if I spoke about these evil, like the good twin and the evil twin of self-esteem, there are people who have high self-esteem who are successful, confident, skilled, educated, and whatnot, right? And all of these positive qualities they have is reflected in their self-esteem. But there are also people who feel highly insecure, who have very, very little temporal stability about their self-esteem, and that have like grandiose ideas about themselves, that are narcissistic, and that's also measured in high self-esteem. So this kind of highlights that often, if we ask explicitly people, that's like we often run into the problem that their high self-esteem, their attitude towards, for instance, another minority, etc., can be caused by multiple different processes that might not actually predict the same behavior, right? So here with self-esteem is this idea that you can have these, it looks like the same on the surface, right? Just like these twins. But then if you go deeper, one of them might be actually a confident, successful person, and the other one might not, but might just be really narcissistic, defensive, and has a very fragile self-esteem. And just to kind of mention that, that's often happens what like this, the second sister, like the second twin, is like defensive, fragile, narcissistic self-esteem. That's often happens when we try to artificially, with self-esteem intervention, try to improve just the self-esteem of a person, that people become more defensive and they become more narcissistic. They often become more aggressive as well. So that's why we think most that self-esteem is not really a good thing to try to change directly. Let me I think we have, let me just have a quick look at the time. Oh, we're doing pretty well, at least for my standards, it's 51. There are covert measures. We come back to this when we talk about the idea of how can we measure well attitudes towards like racism, right? People might not want to say that they're racist because they feel like, oh, this is like, they might not want to admit it to themselves. They might not want to admit it to the experimenter. So sometimes there are indirect measures. For instance, sometimes people measure seating distance. So it's like, okay, Andreas said he likes, I don't know, like people from, I'm not sure, he likes Germans, okay? So it's like, so you measure my, it's like, oh yes, I like Germans, but then I come into the room and then you see where I'm sitting. I'm sitting further away from the Germans and more closely to the British people. And it's like, oh, he's saying one thing but acting. So there's this idea of covert measures of behavior. The same as the idea of these covert measures, implicit measures. They're behavioral covert measures and the behavioral implicit measures. And we talk, I want to say ad nausea, but at length about this in our next session on implicit measures on kind of unconscious bias and racism, so that you know this is something that grew out of the idea is like, oh, we need to find different ways of measuring attitudes that kind of circumvent certain attitudinal, certain defensive mechanisms. Okay. I think I'll try to do a little bit of this before I think we have like 3-4 minutes, and before we are done with this lecture here, and talk a little bit about attitude formation. So there are like the next two chapters, this one and the next one, about where are our attitudes are coming from, okay? And so one of them is like basically by direct experience, which sounds kind of like duh, but it's actually more interesting than you think, or that might sound like, right? Just like this idea, okay, I want to now learn about why do some people stand on the side of the miners and someone violently opposed to the miners, as in the 80s and the miner strikes here in the UK. You might feel like, okay, why do some people really love the iPhone, and why some people really are kind of like they think Android is so much better, right? It often feels like on the surface you can't really differentiate between these two phones and their features, but somehow people have really strong beliefs. Where is this coming from? There's also why do have some people like different attitudes towards behaviors, right? You can imagine like the bully. Why does a person who bullies have kind of like a positive attitude towards this behavior? Where is this coming from? The most and kind of like direct and easiest explanation, on which is at times of course true, is that you have a certain direct experience with the attitude object, right? I said beforehand, when you ask me, Andreas, do you like Germans? Maybe growing up in Germany, I had a lot of direct experience with Germans, left me feeling like not too excited about those guys. And so by direct experience, I developed the negative attitudes towards Germans, which is not true, but it's just like a hypothetical example. So you can try the phone, you can try maybe like having experience within a certain political setting, etc. So you get basically, you engage with the attitude object, and that kind of backfires or is really rewarding, and that forms your attitude. But one of the more interesting, and this is probably where we'll stop this lecture, is the idea that often these preferences, our attitudes, do not really need any conscious processing or any conscious contact, okay? So this is a super influential paper by Science, right? You can tell he's like written Scion. If you know psychology, you say Science, that kind of qualifies you to be a good social psychologist. And what he said is we don't need any cognition to form positive or negative attitudes towards objects. And how he did that was basically by, you would come into the laboratory, and then we said like in the first room, he would say like, please sit down. And then you would see some flashes. You just see some flashes of light. This was the 80s. They didn't have computer screens, etc., to do these things. And why did you see these flashes of lights? Because you were in this dark room, and with the flash of the light, sometimes he would show certain Chinese characters, right? And so you would sit in his room and you would only see some flashes, but your brain would perceive these Chinese characters. And thereafter, he would show you certain Chinese characters, and he would say like, okay, we're interested in how people, like their aesthetic preferences. What do we mean by aesthetic preferences? We mean how they perceive aesthetically looking objects and what their opinions about is. And we will show you some Chinese characters. And we ask you just to tell us, how much do you prefer these? How positively do you evaluate these Chinese characters? And what you can see, basically, they measure their attitude towards these Chinese characters. And what you can see is if they were familiar, that is, if they have seen just beforehand these Chinese characters, they had a relatively positive attitude. They couldn't remember ever seeing them, but they still developed, due to the familiarity with them, a positive attitude towards them. And then the Chinese characters they haven't seen, they had a negative attitude towards that. This is what's often called the mere exposure effect, an effect that is basically underlies 60% of all advertisement, that you just have to merely expose people to a certain attitude object, and that will increase their attitude positively. You can see this in lectures. I will not walk you through this. Basically, in the study on the left, what they did is they or maybe I explain it and I like take the minute and then we make this the last slide. What they do is they look at how students evaluate the attractiveness of for students. And so I think these are all for female students. And at the beginning, at the kind of pre-test, everyone evaluates these students similarly. And then one student would come to 15 lectures. This is in the US, they have a little bit more lectures over there. The other one, then another one would come to only 10 lectures. Another one would only come to 5 lectures, and another one would come to no lecture. And what you can see is that the person that was merely exposed more often than the others grew in attractiveness. So after the students were done and they were showing these pictures again, often they didn't have any recollection of actually seeing the student in any of the lectures, but more often the student was present, the more positive their attitude towards that student. And this is kind of like the idea where you often think like, oh, this advertisement looks so lazy. They're not even trying to convince me that this is a good laundry detergent or something like that. No, they think that by merely exposing you to this product, it will take care of itself, okay? And I will stop this lecture today here. And then let me kind of stop the recording.